2020, the year of the unprecedented. When we tell our future children and our grandchildren about 2020, we're going to focus in on what it felt like to be in unprecedented times. From sheltering in place to how the school year kind of unceremoniously ended to the world just kind of hitting the big red pause button. Plus, everything else going on now with the rising cases in our state, plus the protests for change. Honestly, at this point, I think it's safe to assume in some ways that no one else has ever dealt with what we are facing to this extreme. I mean, yes, there are a few examples of people in history in similar circumstances, such as Martin Luther, who was this famous monk and church revolutionary who wrote most of his writings during the bubonic plague. Or Anne Frank, who, while in hiding in Nazi-occupied Germany, just kind of wrote about her thoughts and feelings as being a Jewish teenager during one of the worst times in history. And as we find ourselves in this moment, I believe that one of the best examples of how to survive in isolation comes from one of the most influential Christian writers during the Roman Empire era, Paul of Tarsus. Time after time, Paul found himself in moments of isolation, from being shipwrecked to being imprisoned. Over these next few weeks, we're actually going to be looking at some of his writings to find advice and guidance on how to use this time to the best that we possibly can. Because let's face it, it's not easy being alone, especially to the amount that we have found ourselves experiencing over the past 100 plus days. I'm not introverted slightly. However, I have seen and had conversations with some of my most introverted friends who are starting to realize how much they need people around. I mean, it's fun to laugh and joke with people. It's comforting to see their eyes and watch their reactions while we speak. And if we can be honest for a second, one of the biggest challenges with all of this alone time is when we are alone, we have no one else to blame for our issues. I mean, I would love to be able to point to someone else as the reason why I'm unhappy or didn't achieve what I had set forth to achieve today. However, if I'm alone, then I'm the only one to blame. With that now out in the open, I feel like all this time alone gives us the chance to reflect on who we are and how we are doing. I mean, we now find ourselves in a moment where we're all forced to kind of take stock of ourselves and ask these questions. Do I like how I'm doing? Do I like where I'm going? Am I going anywhere? All this time alone allows us to reflect on our current status mentally, socially, emotionally, and or romantically. In the summer of 2020, we finally have the time to evaluate ourselves and ask this question. Do I like what I see? Like I mentioned before, over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at some of Paul's writings. Many of these passages that he worked on and many of these letters that he had written were done while he was in isolation or he had just recently come out of isolation. To kind of give you a little backstory on Paul, he endured at least 3 different shipwrecks and spent at least 4 years in prison at some point in his life. So as you can imagine, he had a lot of time to reflect on himself. And not surprisingly, Paul saw some things in his life that he didn't like. His conclusions, however, I feel like are different than what I would usually come up if I was in that situation, and you would probably agree as well. See, what Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 12:9-10 says this, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." In this part of Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he calls his shortcomings weaknesses. But instead of being bitter or frustrated about them, he says that he is thankful. He is delighted that he has areas of his life where Christ can come through and shine. Paul sees his shortcomings as an opportunity for God to be given more glory. If you didn't know, or maybe you need a quick refresher, Paul's mindset was not always like this. This is a guy who started out his adult life persecuting and arranging the arrest of early members of the church. However, after a pretty big life-changing moment, he did a full 180 and went on to write most of the passages that you can find now in the New Testament of the Bible. And not only that, but in one of his letters, we actually find out that he was nearly blind, so he would actually have to dictate his letters while someone else wrote. Can you imagine having a job like that? And so you're probably wondering, why would God use this guy to reach so many people? It's so that God could be given more glory. As Paul wrote, he is thankful for his weaknesses because it gives the opportunity to demonstrate just how strong God is. Look, you see, God is not surprised that you aren't perfect. Actually, he's probably more aware of your shortcomings than you are. He knows your strengths and he knows your weaknesses. And honestly, during these past few months, you might have learned what some of those were during this time of solitude. But remember, God knows you better than you know yourself. So with that being said, we shouldn't be ashamed of our weaknesses. We shouldn't be trying to hide our shortcomings from God. No, I believe that if Paul were here today in 2020, he would say the same exact thing to take advantage of this moment that we have. If 2020 has provided us with anything, it has provided us with time. So right now is a great time to reflect on where we are and where we are going. But we must make sure that we are giving God the room and the opportunity to turn our weakness into strengths for him. And we don't do that until we take the time and put into the effort to self-reflect and be honest with ourselves. So here's my challenge for you today and this week. Take some time to meditate each day this week, 10 to 15 minutes, where you can eliminate distractions, and maybe you find yourself either diving into some of the letters that Paul wrote, or you're in a really good Devo that you can find on the Bible app, or maybe you're listening to some worship music on your playlist on Apple Music or Spotify, or maybe you're just sitting in a quiet space to pray, to ask yourself this question: what am I learning about myself in this time alone? Then have these very same conversations with your tribes where you can cheer each other on and you can hold each other accountable with this practice of self-reflection. Because Anthem, remember that God knows you better than you know yourself. And by giving him the room and by giving him the opportunity, he can turn our weaknesses into strengths.